Our panel members today, who we are so excited to have and share with you today. First, Rebecca Mott. Rebecca used to do indoor prostitution of various types, all of which allowed punters to be violent. She's now an abolitionist and has been blogging about her experiences for more than 12 years, explaining the conditions of prostitution and the impact on having trauma as an exited woman. Next, we have Luba Fein with us. Hi, Rebecca. Next, we have Luba Fein with us. Luba is a feminist abolitionist activist from Israel. Try saying that 3 or 4 times quickly. And she has actively promoted the Nordic model in our country, where the sex purchase ban was enforced earlier this year. So, hi, Luba. And finally, Jade. Jade started in street and brothel prostitution as a teenager, then moved into stripping and glamour modelling as an adult. She now works to create support services for women who have exited or who want to exit. So as I say, we're so excited and so honoured to have the 3 of them take the time to speak with us today. The first question I'm going to put to the 3 of you as the panel is prostitution, work or exploitation? What are your views on this and the much repeated idea that sex work is normal work? What would be great is if Luba, you would like to start with the research presentation you've put together for us in response to this question.
Prostitution, work or violence? This is our question today. I will, in this presentation, I will show that prostitution is certainly violence. I will prove that it doesn't meet basic criteria for work. And I will also prove that the general accepted conventions of our society and the labor market prove that everyone knows this, even those people with red umbrellas who chant sex work is work. Let's start. Prostitution is certainly violence. Why? Some sex trade apologists say that prostitution is just consensual sex between 2 adults. But for sexual relationship to be consensual, 3 preconditions should be met. 1, the freedom to choose a sexual partner. The second one, the freedom to choose the timing, which means that if I chose my husband and he forces me into sex at a particular time of the day when I don't want it, it will be rape, right? We don't accept it as consensual, even if I chose him. And the third precondition is the freedom to select the nature of the sexual activity. We talk a lot about it nowadays, that if you said yes, it doesn't mean yes to everything, right? This is quite a consensus, what I said now about 3 preconditions. And what happens in prostitution? In prostitution, you cannot choose your so-called partner. Only the sex buyer chooses the partner. Sometimes we witness personal evidences of people who say, actually, I can choose my punters, I can choose my clients, but if you ask a little bit more, you understand the meaning, and the meaning is not choosing, but being able to sometimes reject a repulsive client. It is not like choosing. In prostitution, you have to accept from 100 to 1,000 clients per month, depends on how attractive you are or what are your conditions are. And there is no way to make sure that you have this amount of consensual partners in 1 month. The second precondition, the timing. The timing is completely or almost completely depends on the sex buyer. You are expected to supply the service at the time that the buyer expects. It is not your timing. And the last one, the nature of the sexual activity also depends on what the sex buyer wishes, on what he paid for. Again, if you are extremely young, attractive, and probably independent, Sometimes you can decline extreme proposal, but the very nature of the sexual activity is defined by the sex buyer. You agree to get money, and he defines the course of the action. So we have, in prostitution, we have 100% non-consensual sex. It cannot be framed otherwise as than violence. It's very hard in this situation to keep asking whether it can be work, but I will proceed and explain why prostitution cannot be defined a job. It is not a job. In the labor market, some conventions exist. One of them is that every employee should perform some sort of labor to get paid. You should cook, teach, drive, or just watch or be concentrated, but you must supply labor, some sort of labor. I'm not trying to say that in prostitution you are doing nothing, getting money. This is another misogynistic myth. I don't support it, but in prostitution, putting extra labor is unnecessary. This is not a necessary precondition, because in human trafficking and sex trafficking, we face every time cases where people were sold while being completely unconscious, passed out, refusing. Children are sold. So the only necessary condition for being sold in prostitution is to let other people to perform acts on your body. This is not how we perceive work in this society. And the other criteria for work is expertise. In any sort of profession, any kind of profession, expertise is valued and rewarded. Everyone should be experienced. The more experienced you are, the higher you are paid, right? This is right for both highly professional occupations and non-professional occupations. When we look for a cleaner, we look for references too. We need the experienced waiter, experienced cleaner. Sometimes people tell me that a model should be young and inexperienced, but this is not true. The model indeed should be young, but usually a beginning model will work for free for some time to have an impressive portfolio. Until she proves that she's experienced, she won't be even paid. In prostitution, the less expertise you have, the more you are paid. We see all the time, we see online proposals of women who sell their virginity, and those women sometimes earn tens of thousands or even more. And the highly experienced prostitute, 40 years old, earns a very small amount of money. We all, I think, if you, every woman who worked in organized place like brothel or escort service, we all know that punters often call and ask for youngest women and the newest women. They call and say, who are your newest girls are? And then when you are new, you are on high demand, and then if you are not for long there, you keep lying that I'm a new girl until you cannot lie anymore. This is absolutely not a normal situation for work. In work, you sometimes lie that you have experience when you don't have it. So being paid for being new and inexperienced is more remind of car rental than professional service, right? And now, what I want to prove that everyone knows that prostitution is not work. Even the worst sex trade apologists know it. Even those people with red umbrellas, as I said before, who chant sex work is work, they know that they say complete nonsense. And I will explain why. Because our society, our labor market have certain conventions, and those conventions prove that everybody understands what prostitution actually is. For example, our labor market is very dynamic nowadays, right? Job descriptions change, and organizations change, and we switch to lean structure, and there is outsourcing to Asia. We face many changes all the time, and very often bosses can change your job description. They can say, see, we are going through downsizing. Now you should do some additional work or to learn something new. It is new for you, but we must do it to keep this organization going. So sometimes I was working in a bank long ago, and someday we were asked to clean our workstations. Okay, because no money for cleaner anymore. Or sometimes secretary can be asked to make coffee for guests, or front desk worker can be asked to work in the archive for some time. But no company in no industry will ask employees to sleep with important clients. Actually, why not? It can produce a lot of money, and clients might be more satisfied, but it never happens, right? Because everyone understands what prostitution is, and it does not work. Another example, unemployment services don't refer the unemployed to sex work. And here I took a screenshot from Facebook page from New Zealand. New Zealand is a country which is a poster child for decriminalization of prostitution. They call it sex work. They pretend to turn prostitution in another service industry, right? But their unemployment services guided, instructed to not take benefits, unemployment benefits from people who refuse to work in brothels. And when someone complained about being referred to a brothel, she was taken care of, and she didn't lose her benefits. But why not? Actually, why not? See, I'm happy that it doesn't happen. I obviously don't want it, but they just prove that they understand as well as I do that prostitution is not work. And you cannot push a person, even unemployed and destitute, to prostitution. Another example, leaving a job doesn't require long and expensive rehabilitation. Here in Israel, while we tried to promote the sex purchase ban, we were asked to prove that we have wide enough range of trauma-focused rehabilitation services. And the question is why? If prostitution was just a job, we should establish maybe a vocational training, or just better unemployment service, right? But we needed rehabilitation centers. Why? Those rehabilitation centers are very similar to the centers that we have for victims of domestic violence or victims of rape. So everyone understands that prostitution is very similar to other sorts of abuse and not other sort of employment. One more example, very good example. In the last 2 decades, we have more and more people, researchers and policymakers who insist that prostitution is work. Some of them published articles, books, research papers. We all know a couple of names in our countries. Those people insist that prostitution is work. But for some reason, which we all understand, they never try to turn themselves into subjects in this experiment. Not even one of them is going to do this sex work. They will go to the rallies with sex worker or whatever it is. They will insist that sex workers have agency, but they never ever try to do it, even for a day, for a week, for a month. This is no, this is just a obvious act, right? Because anthropologists always try to live in the field they research, right? Anthropologists went to Sentinel, they lived with criminals. They did so much to be a part of their research field, but never in prostitution. We must ask ourselves why. Probably because they understand it. And the last example, probably there are many more, but I will use just only one more. Our kids, not even one, no one, no functioning parent will want to see his or her kids in prostitution. Not even one. Those people will defend prostitution and they will call it work, but it is not work for their kids. And when I say it, many people argue that, okay, but we don't want our kids to flip burgers in McDonald's or to be cleaners, or some over-sophisticated say, I don't want them to be lawyers. But if we think about it, as a temporary occupation, no one will oppose his or her kid to do any job. Like, I don't want my kid to flip burgers for the entire life in McDonald's, but if this, in this picture, you see the girl, if this would be my kid on summer vacation, I would be very happy. I would be proud of my hardworking child, right? Every other parent will. And if this would be your child, how would you feel? Whether it is on summer vacation or till the end of your life, you will never ever, if you are a normal parent, you will never ever allow your child to do this. You will do anything to prevent, anything to save your kid from this situation. And the conclusion is that if we are not moral hypocrites, we should understand that if prostitution is not for us, if it is not for our kids, then it is not for anybody else. Let's stop it now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Luba. That was a really fantastic presentation. I mean, you delved into so much there that there's not time to unpick absolutely everything, certainly by me, but it's really, I feel like the main kind of highlights for that were they're talking about it can't be fully consensual if only the buyer has the full freedom of like choice of partner and timing and nature and the activities that go on. It can't be a fully consensual act if only one person has that freedom and has that choice. And also your contrast about in any other scenario, would you accept, sexual favors or sex work as part of your professional development? Would you have other women in your life doing it? And I noticed somebody asked that in the Q&A. Somebody had highlighted would people who advocate for the sex trade, would they have the women in their life do it if they had any other options? So again, thank you so much for that, Luba. Rebecca, could kind of further on to what Luba was saying, could we ask you about your opinion on the question sex work as work?
Yeah, hello everyone. I feel like when we talk about sex work being work, we need to look clearly at what prostitution is for the vast majority of women who do it, and not sugarcoat it with ideas that we want to believe. I mean, to me, most prostitution is the conditions of trafficking, and often is the conditions of torture and a violation of human rights. I say this because I've never known a prostitute who freely chose to be prostituted, or even a prostitute who can live with knowing that every single man that comes to see her is going to be non-violent. Every time you go into prostitution, there is a chance of violence. There is even a chance of being murdered and of being tortured. This is not normal. This is not a job. I get quite annoyed by the comparisons with other jobs. yes, other jobs are very dangerous, such as they always bring up logging, which doesn't seem to happen that much anymore, but they bring it up anyway. Well, it is, if a tree falls on you in a forest as a logger, you will probably get the union or other people giving you compensation. The same with other jobs where it's violence is normal. It is normal to actually have a union, have compensation, have even the media will write about it and say this is terrible. And often when there's work injuries or deaths, there may even be an inquiry by governments. None of this happens for prostituted women. This is women, they are just expected to put up with it, not complain. And if they do complain, they may be put into more violent aspects of the sex trade. I also feel like you can't call it a job when there is such a high rate of murder. What other job are people murdered in? Police are killed, but it's not murder. It's not done on a regular basis. Soldiers are killed, but that is in a war. You know, that is not done as a job. I mean, so that is a job. Sorry. Anyway, I'll let someone else speak. Sorry, I'm running out of steam.
I do know what you mean though, Rebecca, like just those comparisons of when you compare it to any other paid job or expectation, that it just simply isn't the same, and the rates of violence you wouldn't expect in other forms of work, and if they did happen you would expect consequences to the perpetrators of that you don't see in the sex trade. And Jade, what about you? What would your response be to that question of this idea in our culture that sex work is normal work?
So I think that it's important, to my point, to set out that there's sort of three very broad routes into the sex trade that I would call sort of trafficking, survival and choice. And when we look at choice, sex workers, as much as I hate the term, we're looking at women who have other choices that are reasonable, accessible. They're not facing immediate homelessness. They're not looking to feed children, struggling with addiction. You know, they really, they could go elsewhere with this. But this is such a tiny percentage of the women in the industry. And actually they get pushed right to the front because their conditions really are, out of all of it, they're still not fantastic. They're still in an environment of misogyny, but their conditions are the most preferable. That's just the tip. There's a huge iceberg under the water of women whose conditions are horrendous. They are not there by choice. They are vulnerable, and they're in need. And for me, if you were to challenge and address and erase all of the vulnerabilities that got them there, and you somehow manage to stamp out human trafficking, and then 99% of your workers disappeared, that's not a job, is it? That's exploitation. People will go to work willingly because they enjoy their job, they like their job, they want to go, and that may not be every day, it may not be your ideal place of work, but it's not, I'm going to go to this job I absolutely hate, removes my bodily autonomy, is violent, it's terrifying, I have no choice over what I do when I'm there. You know, if I say no to my pimp, he could beat me to death. No one is experiencing that environment in their workplace. They're protected by the law to make sure that doesn't happen. The sex trade is exploitation of the most vulnerable, and it thrives on an environment of isolation.
And just continues to thrive on those women kind of being in that forced situation, I suppose, as well. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
if we're able to reach out and help women, they leave. And if we were able to address the issues as a whole, as a society, they wouldn't be replaced either.
Absolutely. Well, I think between the three of you, you have completely deconstructed the notion that sex work is normal work. So thank you everyone for your contributions there. What, if it's all right, we'll move on to the next question, another one we received in a previous webinar, which is, if you want to eliminate violence against women, and we know the police are often sexist against women, why will more laws help women when it gives the police more power? Which of you would like to go first around that question?
Okay. May I?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is an important question, actually. And first of all, it is essential to note that any law gives the police additional power. So Nordic model is not some exclusion. So the Sex Purchase Act certainly has a feature that must be planned carefully. Further exposure of highly vulnerable women in prostitution to police forces. Police representatives may be sexist, insensitive, and even violent towards marginalized populations. We know it. But just let's just think what happens when the police do not approach women in prostitution. Are they protected? No, they are abandoned to the mercy of pimps and johns, a much more violent and sexist population. Therefore, merely keeping away the police is not the solution. It is essential to make clear here that the aim of the Nordic model is eventually to make sure that as few women as possible stay in prostitution. No one deserves to live in constant exposure to pimps, johns, or even cops. Meanwhile, we should think about how to reduce the possible harm to women in prostitution. One solution might be to apply the Swedish method in which social workers accompany the police officers during the raids on the brothels. Another option could be comprehensive training for police officers, which would be delivered also by the sex trade survivors. But the bottom line is that exposing women in prostitution to the police is an issue. It must be planned wisely, but canceling a law is not an answer. No one would think of repealing a law against domestic violence, which also exposes vulnerable women to police officers, right? Thank you for listening to me.
That's very true. All of that's very true. Rebecca or Jade, what would you think?
I think my position on it is that I totally agree with Luba. There's obviously issues within police forces about how they approach marginalised communities, including women. But my personal belief is that there are some laws where actually the violence and the sexism comes out with a failure to enforce the law fully. And an example I've used before is the law criminalising marital rape in 1991. The sexism within that is actually when the police fail to prosecute that fully. I struggle to see a way in which that could be enforced in a sexist manner against a woman. It doesn't. The definition of rape doesn't include women in that sense. So for me, it would be a police force that doesn't enforce or fails to enforce a law that would be a sexist police.
Definitely. Rebecca, did you want to add anything to that around that question?
In the wrong
We got you
button.
back, yay.
Well, I feel that often this argument is used by people to distract rather than being a really proper question, and because I feel it's a way of saying let's not talk about the violence done by punters and Johns and sex trade profiteers. Let's say it's the police that is the main problem. And actually, most prostitutes are much more afraid of what happens inside prostitution than they would be of the police, even the most sexist and racist police. I do think the police need to be trained very completely differently to how they are now in my country, England. And I also think that it's really important that we don't just train the police, but we educate society into questioning, you know, why women are arrested, why women are threatened with being made homeless if they do prostitution. We need to have not just the police trained, but the whole of society needs to actually understand that the violence that is done in their name. You know, it's not just the individual punter and John that's the problem. It's the fact that we condone their violence and make it invisible. And this is just part of making it invisible.
Absolutely, and it's, I think, further to that point, Rebecca, the countries where the Nordic model has been implemented successfully, like Norway or Sweden, part of that has been because there has been this whole cultural shift in services and in society generally towards the same aims as the Nordic model, where some other places it's not been implemented quite as successfully because there hasn't been that same full shift in that training for police and other services. So that's all of those answers from the three of you are absolutely spot on. One thing before we move on was that another Nordic Model member had said, she won't mind me sharing this, when we were looking at the questions beforehand, was she'd made a point about there being a need for more and higher ranking female officers as well, because when we're concerned about sexism within the police, that's something that has been shown that can help, that one woman alone is a great achievement, but it doesn't make a difference to a whole culture. So that's something that she'd pointed out, which was, I thought, very appropriate as well. Thank you to all the participants for all the questions that are coming in. These are great. We will not get to them all, and I'm really sorry that we won't, but we, as I said before, we are keeping questions to help inform our future webinars as well, so please keep those coming, everyone. Thank you for that. For the panel members, one question we did have for them: how do you think the rise in online sex work, such as cam work and OnlyFans, feeds into this? Do you feel this could be a rise into safer sex work, or a gateway into the experiences and environments that you've talked about previously? What do we think? Who would like to take that one on first?
May I? Okay, thank you. Okay, so some people call webcam prostitution safe and even a privilege. And I agree that when you meet your clients online, it is physically safer because they cannot murder or cannot beat you, which is significant. But still, I reject the framing of online prostitution as outright safe for three reasons. And the first reason is that webcamming is not completely harmless. In this area, women are required to perform degrading and humiliating acts on themselves as per the requirement of the client. It will be safe to say that this experience is traumatizing for many women. The second reason is exposure. Every field of prostitution has unique risks, and the individual risk of webcamming is a considerable exposure, which a woman has no control over. Now, every woman in the sex trade wants to exit. Almost every woman lives with this idea of exited someday. And exited prostitution is never, ever easy. This is an arduous journey. You need to start a new life without valuable skills, with addictions, with trauma, with extremely low self-efficacy. So add to all these issues the fear of being exposed. You can never know who took your screenshots and who can see them. It haunts women for years, and I know it. And the third reason is what already have been mentioned in the question, that webcam prostitution or OnlyFans, it is a gate to offline prostitution. Switching from online to offline, or switching between different fields of prostitution is ubiquitous among women in the sex trade. And in webcam prostitution, women often say, I am already in the sex trade, so why to not make a little bit more money offline? It happens all the time. So for this reason and many others, we believe that we should educate men not to consume women's bodies, rather than fake for them safer alternative, which are not really safe. Thank you.
Jade, I feel like you would have a lot to say about this question as well. Would it be okay to hear from you?
I think that the OnlyFans, the webcam prostitution phenomenon, picks up very successfully on the fact that many of the young women who get into doing this have now grown up with a virtual environment. They feel like technology is a normal part of their world, and they have grown up with the reality that if they put something on the internet, it's there forever. And because it's so normal for young people now, that it's almost a decrease in the fear that should really come along with something like that, of someone anywhere in the world having possession of something of yours, of you, for the rest of time, really. So when and if they decide to move into OnlyFans and webcam prostitution, there's already been a desensitization to the idea that you cannot control what you have put out onto the internet. And so that in itself, trying to work out how to frame this question. It's difficult because it gives it a facade of being not dangerous, purely because they're so used to not having that level of control. And although the physical risk that you might see in physical prostitution, in indoor and outdoor prostitution, may not be there, it does not mean that it is not risky, that it is not dangerous, that things have not happened to women who exclusively do OnlyFans or webcam. You know, you cannot control who views it, and there are people who are seriously unhinged out there who will track women and will find them. So that risk doesn't go away. It doesn't make it less risky, and then there's real world risks. You don't develop skills. You'll have a huge gap in your CV. You might decide to stop at 25 and then find out that actually you can't get a job. You can't explain away 7 years of no employment, no skills. You can't explain where your money's come from. You eventually have to start telling people what you did. It loses you employment opportunities. You know, and this is all stuff that young women are not taking into account when they make these choices that seem so normal now and so just not risky. And I think that that's very insidious, because when you get then the proportion that do move into more physical forms of the sex trade, whether that be sort of stripping or prostitution, they're unprepared for the physical risk, for the physical reality of these jobs. And really they've completely lost that control over their autonomy, both virtually and in real life. And I feel like that's sad, but unfortunately it's very hard to go backwards, because how can you challenge something that starts with the internet? How do you challenge that?
Yeah. Insidious is just the perfect word to sum that up, I think, Jade, because I think it's also part of it. I feel like it's sold, I've certainly seen ads where it's sold as this kind of idea of work from home, work when you want, earn just enough money to do X, Y, and Z. It's sort of almost like it's an MLM type idea, and that's really troubling. And insidious is just the perfect word for that. So, and Rebecca, do you or Jade please go on? Whoever.
I think another point to make as well is that to sort of late teens, early 20s girls, the idea of self-branding is very appealing. That they can create a whole brand out of themselves. And I think a lot convince themselves initially that they are being paid to be a sexualized version of who they are. And we see this in celebrities, you know, like Paris Hilton was one and Kim Kardashian is another, who, you know, they essentially have made millions out of themselves. They're selling themselves, not sexually, but they are selling their image, who they are. Unfortunately, women who weren't already extraordinarily rich have to offer something a bit more, and that something tends to be, unfortunately, their bodies, their sexuality.
Sorry?
Yeah, Rebecca, if you're ready to go there, maybe.
Yeah. I feel that you have no control over. Once you put anything out on the net, you lose control of the imagery, you lose control of ownership. And I mean, for example, a lot of women who've done underage prostitution or underage porn, or have all in incest, have had their photos taken and often put on the net. They have no control over how that is used. It can go into Pornhub. It can just go around the world. I mean, I had photos taken of me as a child by my stepfather, which he put on the net. And I think it seems like a good idea at the time often, but you don't realize how your control is completely stolen as soon as you put an image onto the net. It can, you know, they can sell it to any company they like in the world. You know, if they want to sell it to Pornhub, they will. If they want to sell it if they want to blackmail you, they will. I mean, it's not your property anymore. And I think this is the thing that is the thing is that when you leave, that's can be the hardest thing to get over, to know that your images are still out there, you know, and that they're still being, you know, there's still men wanking over them, basically, you know.
To put it bluntly, yeah, absolutely right. And thank you for, you know, sharing that past experience with us, and being able to talk about that, Rebecca. Yes, absolutely true. Just to remind everybody of kind of some other wee things about the webinar. Keep the questions coming in. As I say, we won't have time to answer them all, but we will keep them for future. And if you are following the talk on Twitter, it's #NMNTalk. So between my handwriting and my clearly wonderful positioning, I hope everyone managed to catch that. It's #NMNTalk if you're following the conversation on Twitter today. If everybody's okay with that, we can move on to our next question. It's a bit of a long one, and we've touched on elements of it already, all three of you, but here we go. I am a trafficking survivor and agree that the sex trade is violent and abusive. However, since the Nordic model was introduced to Ireland, all available studies show that violence and trafficking has increased. There is no evidence to show the Nordic model is a viable solution. Is it not time to look beyond this failed framework? There is nothing feminist about promoting a model that causes more harm to women. Luba, I know you've done a considerable amount of work looking at the evaluations of the Nordic model in the various countries it's been introduced. So perhaps you would like to go first with this question again. I think all three of you have touched on elements of this already, I think. But if you could, that would be much appreciated. And then Rebecca and Jade, if you have anything further, that would be great to hear from you.
May I? Okay. So first, yes, I have published a review on the report which from Northern Ireland. There are no all available studies. There was one right now. There is one available report on effect of the Nordic model in Northern Ireland. This is one report, which is very long. And I have published another review of all available reports from different Nordic model countries. Both reviews are available on the Nordic Model Now site. And anyone, if you are willing to read them, so please, you can get links from the Nordic Model Now site, or just to Google Luba Fein Nordic Model Now, you will find them. So the study about the review of the Nordic model in Northern Ireland It was a huge evaluative report, 200 pages long. I read all of them. And we have Anna Fisher and myself published a very long review just about this report. So this report is, it has several interesting conclusions, but in the abstract you can find the claim that Nordic model harmed the people in the sex trade because the violence against, they use this term sex workers, I will cite it. So but when you read the report, you can see that it is full of biases and mental shenanigans. And I will just give you one or two examples because there are too many, everything in the review anyway. So two main sources of the data in this report are two NGOs, Sway and Ugly Mugs. They call themselves sex worker NGOs. So less knowledgeable audience might assume that there must be highly knowledgeable and reliable sources, but this is not true. Usually, if you see this term sex workers NGO, you can know for sure that this is anti-Nordic model organization. We don't call themselves sex workers or ex-sex workers. We use the term survivor. And this is a very good indication of the stand of those NGOs. So both NGOs are actively involved in promoting the blanket decriminalization of the sex trade, which involves the removal of all legal sanctions against paying for sex, pimping, running mega brothels. So the anti-Nordic model and the Nordic model is, they're interested to cancel it actually. So they cannot, they are biased in the beginning. And Ugly Mugs Ireland is more than just ideologically biased because it was co-founded by owners of the prostitution advertising website Escort Ireland. So this is their sort, commercial online pimp. But when you read the results, just let's ignore this, what I said now. Let's imagine that Ugly Mugs Ireland is completely reliable. When I read the result, I discover more surprises. For example, the report claims that there have been an increase in reports of violence against sex workers to Ugly Mugs. First, the increase is in reports, not in violence. We don't know whether people started reporting because they just found out that Ugly Mugs exist. But moreover, if you read into the data about violence and what they call violence, you find out that the violence cases in which increase happened are types of violence as harassment calls, nuisance behaviors, punters not showing up to the appointments. So, I don't. I'm not trying to say that that harassment calls are neglectable or that punter who is not showing up is. It is not a problem for someone who makes living from prostitution. But this, when we read violence, we expect to find violence. And this is not violence we're talking about. So if the Nordic model caused punters to rethink showing up, maybe this is not as bad as one can assume from the abstract. So you should read the report, and I really hope there will be more reports and more data, and we can learn what actually happened in Northern Ireland. But right now, we cannot say for sure that some negative effect was caused in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Luba, for all that. And do you know where that report could be found? If you hadn't already said. I think maybe she's not quite caught me there, but that's okay. Rebecca, do you have anything to add to that around that question? And it was quite a long one, so if you need me to repeat it, go for it as well. Repeat it, okay. So It was, the crux of it was, there's no evidence to show the Nordic model is a viable solution. Is it not time to look beyond the framework because it's failed? There's nothing feminist about promoting it. It causes more harm to women.
Well, I kind of completely disagree, but I also think we need to look at the you know, what the alternatives are, and the alternatives are either making prostitution completely legal, like they do in Germany, which is obviously, I mean, most people would say is a failed experiment and has killed a lot of women, or decriminalisation, which is basically in favour, which is a law that helps men buy prostitution, helps men sell prostitution, but doesn't help the women inside prostitution or anybody else who's inside prostitution. I think that, of course, the Nordic model is not perfect. Nothing, you know, I mean, personally, I don't believe in utopia anyway. So it's kind of like, no law is perfect anyway. But it is the first time in history that survivors of prostitution have been able to feel that they have been listened to, that actually it is about putting the safety of women inside prostitution before everything else. Although it was done mainly for equality of women in Sweden, it's become a much bigger thing than it was when it started. I think each country should do the Nordic model, but frame it to how it would work inside their country. We cannot do it just the Swedish way because we don't live in the same kind of society as Sweden. I went to Sweden, and when I was in Sweden, the thing that really strikes you as an exited woman is how normal it is for men in Sweden to think that the idea of prostitution as a concept is disgusting, and why would any man want to do that? And that is within 40 or 50 years of this becoming law. That's amazing. You know, to actually hear young men in Sweden, and not so young men, I mean, men under 40 really, just say, well, why did we ever think it was a good idea? Is as an exited woman, I couldn't believe it. I almost had to sort of think, this is not a dream. This is actually men are saying this. And I think we need to believe that we can do better for prostituted women and not constantly think, oh, how can we just put a band-aid on a cut arm? You know, you don't save people by band-aiding it. You save people by changing their lives. And another approach is part of that. It's not the whole of it, but it's part of it.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that was your experience, because you hear that about Sweden, so I'm really glad that was your experience actually when you were actually there. And it does have to come with that cultural shift, as we did talk about, I think, in response to question 2. We talked about that a little bit as well. Jade, would you like to add further to that? I'm really interested to hear your thoughts there.
I've actually got nothing further to add, but thank you.
Okay. We'll move on then to the next question, if everyone's still happy to continue with that. One that we have had from the prepared questions from the last webinar. What is more violent and degrading to you, poverty or sex work? Who would like to go first on that one?
Yeah, this is my favorite question actually in every panel. So when we're comparing poverty to prostitution, it is essential to remember that not every kind of poverty is traumatizing. A simple lifestyle is not inherently detrimental to people. People in the most impoverished villages in the world are often happy, physically and mentally healthy, and lead good lives. I cannot say it about women in prostitution. Poverty can have a traumatic effect when it comes with inequality. If essential services are too expensive for the poor, we have a problem. If the impoverished people cannot pay for health and education, this kind of poverty is dangerous. That said, any poverty, not just the dangerous one, makes women vulnerable to soliciting to prostitution, because we often see poor women in prostitution, but they didn't reach prostitution because they had to choose between starvation and prostitution. More often, they just got into difficult situation, like debts, or because the family sacrificed them to improve the family quality of life, or because traffickers promised them to take normative work abroad, and then they reached abroad and got trapped into brothels. These situations can happen to middle-class girls, but to a lesser extent. Women of a low economic status, they're not necessarily destitute, not necessarily hungry, but they're more vulnerable to exploitation, and even not in the situation of dangerous poverty. But now we can ask the question, so what is worse, dangerous poverty, when you cannot pay for health services, or prostitution? So I would actually struggle with this question, but let me elucidate you something. I met a lot of women who exited prostitution, hundreds, if not thousands. Right now, I work on my book about the sex trade in Israel. And I often ask this question, my interviewees, I asked whether you exited with savings, whether you had any savings when you exited. And I learned over and over again that while the sex trade generates huge amount of money, it doesn't stay in women's pockets. The women enter prostitution poor and exit destitute. The money goes to the traffickers, to the pimps, to exploitative families. Best case scenario, it goes to the family, to the drug dealers, to various industries that thrive around the sex trade, but women don't keep the money. So our question should not be what is worse, poverty or prostitution, but what is worse, being poor or being poor and prostituted, with all the related effects, trauma, addictions, illnesses. This is the question we should say.
Brilliant, thank you, Luba, for that. I think that would be a way to reframe that question. Absolutely. Jade or Rebecca, please feel free to come in and stop me talking for a start, but also what are your thoughts on that specific question? How did that make you feel?
I think that the circumstances that poverty can end you up in can be very traumatizing. I think that about all the vulnerabilities that end women up in the sex trade. Often women get to the sex trade and they are already traumatized by what has happened to them, and they fall straight into a lap of an industry that just compounds it for the sake of a facade of fulfilling whatever it is that they were lacking when they came in. Often that's money, it's homelessness, it's the need to fill an addiction, and not being able to financially meet it. So I wouldn't argue that poverty in and of itself is always traumatizing, but an industry that will suck you in no matter what your circumstances in exchange for cash, I think that is traumatizing. I think prostitution is far worse.
I mean, I personally find this yet another question that is used as a red herring often, you know, because it's actually, if you unpick the question, part of it is saying poverty is the only reason women become prostituted. And it becomes like, all we have to deal with is poverty and everything will be fine. Well, that's not true. You know, it's not the only reason women become prostituted. I mean, I was upper middle class, but I came from a family where I was mentally and sexually abused. And I was like, you know, like most women that are abused as children, I had no self-esteem, and I also got used to violent sex. I was used to it before I entered prostitution. So therefore, when I entered prostitution, by the time I entered prostitution, I was already, what I would say, I was already dead before I even entered. I don't think that that is to do with what background you come from. That can be any woman, anywhere. I think usually when people enter prostitution, it's for multiple reasons. It's not just because they're poor, or because they were abused as a child, or because their peers are saying, oh, this seems like a good idea to make money. It's usually a multiple reasons. And I don't think you can enter prostitution if you have high self-esteem. I think it's almost impossible to be prostituted when you love yourself, because there will be a voice inside of you saying, what the fuck, what am I doing? And I think everybody in prostitution has been ground down so much that almost like the reason they joined in the first place can become almost irrelevant, especially when you factor in that anybody who chooses to buy a prostitute has free choice to be as violent as he likes. And even if you've entered prostitution thinking that you chose it, thinking, well, I have enough money to live on, I'm perfectly fine. It doesn't stop. Punters don't care. Punters will beat you up. Punters may torture you. Punters will rape you. They won't ask, why did you become a prostitute? They don't care. And I think we should be actually not talking constantly about why women entered. We should be saying, why are punters allowed to buy another human being just so they can have an orgasm?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see Luba clapping there, and I completely agree with you there, Rebecca. I think that was a really fantastic and succinct way of putting that. So thank you, everybody. We do have time, I think, for another couple of questions if the panelists are up for that, and to continue the discussion. We did have some other questions in advance. Were there any from that list that any of the three of you would particularly like to address? And if not, I'll try and address some of the ones we have just now. What would you prefer?
Up to you. I can answer any question.
Okay. I'll have a wee look at the questions that have come on today, that we've not yet answered in the chat box. Here's one I wonder if you would like to have a go at. Have you encountered, this is for all three of you, have you encountered women in prostitution who have held the opposite stance to you, i.e. desiring to continue working in prostitution and favouring the decriminalisation route? Is that something any of you have ever come across? And I can see that Jade's highlighted that as well. So Jade, if you would like to go, that would be super.
So as anyone who reports for abolitionism, or especially on Twitter, will have experienced, there is quite a strong community on there actually of women in prostitution who hold the opposite stance and favour decriminalisation. And it can be very difficult for abolitionist and pro-decrim women to talk, because we are coming at it from a very different angle. Abolitionists are coming at this from the angle that the punters, the sex buyers, are inherently misogynistic. They are dangerous. They are a risk, not only to prostituted women, but really to all women, with their attitude that they have. And that is misconstrued by women who are still in the industry as an attack on them personally, like they are facilitating these men, and that we are attempting to punish them on our route to ending the sex industry, which can make the conversation very hard, and a lot of the time it does end up, unfortunately, in deadlock. But for anybody on the pro-decrim side that is going along with the hashtag or is indeed listening to this live, abolitionists are never attacking women in prostitution. We are, all three of us panelists, women who have experienced this for ourselves and actually how horrendous it can be. And it only ever comes from a place of wanting to make sure that that can never happen to you or to any other woman or anyone else that ends up in prostitution. And I think that a conversation that bears fruit will only happen when we stop attacking each other. It's not really about us as individuals per se, but really the social change that we hope to enact. And I hope for a society one day where men don't buy women's bodies for sex.
Thank you for making that clear, Jade, and making the position clear of anybody who is an abolitionist, especially yourselves as survivors. Rebecca or Luba, would there be anything you wanted to add to that one? If not, that's okay.
Just a little. I mean, I feel that it's very important to know that most of us, when we were inside prostitution, many of us were very loud about saying that it was a really good thing that we were involved with. I mean, I don't remember ever not saying that it was good. And I think when you're inside prostitution, you are cut off from the real world. And I think it's very important to recognize that part of the reason the sex trade is so good at what it does is that it controls not only the women's physical, but it also controls how they view what is happening to them. And I tend to think that I tend to not respond to women who are inside the sex trade because I feel like they're in a place where they can't hear anyway. And I think that I tend to look back at how I was and think, well, if someone had said to me, what are you doing and why are you doing it? I would have thought, well, it's none of your business. And if someone had said, well, do you want, what do you think about an alternative? I would have thought, well, I'm fine. What you want, go and save the people in Ethiopia, leave me alone, and that's basically, I think it's really hard to get through to someone when they're inside prostitution because for their own mental safety, they have to blank out what's happening to them and block out and only remember the good bits, which even if it's only 2 seconds of good bits a week, it's still, you have to remember. And you block out so much. And that's why being exited can be really awful, because that's what trauma is, is remembering the bad bits and having the bad bits come back inside your body as well as your mind. So, I think it's really important to be careful how you respond.
I can. Do we have time still? Yes.
We do. Yes, please go.
Okay, so I can relate what Rebecca said. I think that almost all of us back a long time ago supported the sex trade, and today I'm trying. I was trying for very long. I was struggling to understand it. And I always ask other survivors about it. You can, I have a couple of interviewees that I have made as a part of a series of podcasts, Listen to Survivors, with another feminist NGO, Philia, and you can listen to it. almost nearly every survivor made this very long journey from supporting the sex trade to becoming an abolitionist. Some people call it false consciousness or Stockholm syndrome. I don't believe in it. I think it is a coping strategy. You cannot stay sane and while understanding that you are being raped every day for money. And just to stay sane, you are trying to say, I'm okay, this is just a normal living situation. Only when you make this journey and you are able to heal yourself and to distance yourself from this experience, you start framing it right way. So I think that if a woman in the sex trade denies the harm, just leave her alone. Don't argue with her, but also don't use her as a proof that sex trade should exist. Because using women in this situation is, I think it is mean, and we should not do it. We have enough evidences and enough proofs that sex industry is violent, and we should not abuse survivors who are going through this right now.
And thank you again so much to our speakers that we're really honoured to have today. Thank you for giving up your time, for sharing your stories, for sharing the work that you've done, for talking about this idea of, really breaking down this idea of like prostitution not being normal work as we understand it, that there's only consent from one side of that arrangement. The comparisons you all made to other industries such as working in the police, working in the army, working in the service trades, and just how working in kind of other dangerous outdoor professions. Rebecca referred to logging, and how the comparisons just cannot. They don't stand up to scrutiny because you don't go into those jobs expecting deliberate targeted violence on your person, and if they do happen, in response you would expect legal action, compensation, support. Thank you for making that comparison. We talked about how for the Nordic model that we advocate for to succeed in countries where it has been implemented, it needs to be a full implementation with service training and cultural wide appreciation and understanding, as opposed to just being put into law. And also particularly like Jade and Rebecca's, particularly their 2 points around the abolitionists are we're looking out for other women and for people in the sex trade. We're not looking to dehumanise them, to take away any autonomy that they do have, or to suggest that their experiences aren't valid. It is all about looking to make sure that nobody has to be in this trade, and anybody who is gets the support they need when they're ready to exit. So thank you everybody so much. Before we all close up today, there's just a few details about Nordic Model now. Whether you're joining us for the first time today, hadn't ever heard of us before, or whether you've been following us for a while, you will find this webinar on our website hopefully tomorrow, and going forward it will be available there as well. And we're usually able to do transcripts of our interviews and talks as well. If you can find us and follow us and interact with us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Overit. I think that's all of our social media platforms, but I'm sure there's maybe one missing there. One thing you could also do for us as people joining us today, the Scottish Government's running an important consultation on their prostitution policy. We'd really like to encourage everyone to respond. You don't need to live in or be from Scotland to respond. As these things often are, it's quite long, it's quite complex, it's quite wordy. It wasn't put together, we think, with the average person in mind to respond. So what we have done to help support anyone wanting to respond is create a crib sheet, which you can simply copy and paste from, and then either just use blankets or edit into your own response. If you do this, responding should only take a few minutes. It would be great to have many abolitionist voices respond to that. There's a link to the crib sheet on the front page of our website at nordicmodelnow.org. And just once again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to everybody who came. Thank you to all the questions you've sent in, and hopefully we'll be able to use those to inform future webinars that we do. Thank you everyone, and I wish everyone the safe best the rest of their day.